This is a video which is probably going to cost me a few subscribers. But then again, speaking on behalf of what you believe in rather than promoting what is popular and going with the flow is what most of us are about, and in my opinion it is also the only really decent way of doing and talking politics. One thing about the Austrian election today which annoys me the most is how the democratic middle has essentially been killed off. Both leaders from the Social Democratic centre-left and the Conservative centre-right have seen the candidates drop out in the first round of voting. The Conservatives made themselves somewhat ridiculous in the months leading up to the first rounds of voting by having the governor of the state of Lower Austria actively meddling within federal politics. He picked the Minister of Interior, Mikl Leitner, who became very popular through her handling of the migrant and refugee crisis, and took her out of the federal government position to work for him and presumably to become his successor as governor. Imagine if the governor of a US state decided to just pick the Secretary of State or some other member of the US president's cabinet, brings them into the state government and does so against the will of the president, thereby making a fool out of the president. This chain of events made the Federal Conservative Party in Austria look weak and not in control of its affairs, which, if we are honest, they aren't. In Austria, the governors of the states have a lot more political power than they would have in Germany or the United States, and as such, for most politicians there, working in a regional government is more attractive than working in the federal government. Then there is the Social Democrats, who govern together with the Conservatives in a coalition government, and who, it has to be said, made a laughable choice when it comes to who they picked as their chancellor, namely Werner Faymann, who resigned after the first round of voting, and who probably did a lot of damage to the reputation of the party on a national level. Then there's the added bonus that both the Conservatives and the Social Democrats governed together in coalition governments since 2007. Nothing is as harmful for the democratic middle than having both the centre-right and the centre-left govern together in a coalition, for it only leaves the extremes as the opposition to point out the flaws, mistakes, and for the people to turn to when disappointed. I prefer centre-left, far-left coalitions, centre-right, far-right coalitions, and centre-left libertarian and centre-right libertarian coalition governments, cases which leave a centrist party with a commitment to democracy as its core principles within the opposition. Austria is a weird exception in this regard, since it once had a centre-left, far-right coalition government. And the other thing that really annoys me is the main political development that triggered these results and the consequent election. For it wasn't the failures of the Austrian government that triggered the shift towards the extremes, but the failures of a foreign government. The Austrian government introduced migrant quotas. The Austrian government was clear about not taking economic migrants, abusing the crisis. The Austrian government built walls and fences along its borders to seal off migrant routes. And it was the Austrian government which, when the German Merkel government refused to restore order, decided to ignore the German government, got together with the governments of Hungary, Slovakia, Croatia, Bulgaria and Serbia, and together with these countries coordinated the closing of the Balkan routes. And despite these reasonable policy decisions and efforts, it is the Austrian government that is being punished, because it was the Austrians who had to suffer the consequences of a disastrous policy decision made by a foreign government. That in itself, to me, is the most annoying part of this election, and is something of which the writing was on the wall even a year ago. The decision by Merkel to go for an open borders policy, to utterly disregard the concerns of neighboring nations and to arrogantly reject all criticisms and warning signs over the consequences. That decision is now manifesting its consequences not only through terrorist attacks and migrant crimes, but through Europe's people turning their backs to the democratic centres because this colossal mistake was committed by a figure of the democratic centre. The realization will soon dawn upon those sitting in the Merkel cabinet that the decision they made and promoted has not only sown the seeds of discontent amongst the German public, but has isolated Germany in Europe, and has isolated and framed the democratic process and the democratic middle throughout Europe. I know that blaming Merkel has become somewhat of a cliché phrase, here in Germany especially, but there can be no doubt about it that this push towards the far right in Europe is because of Merkel's open borders policy. The candidates of this election itself also bother me. There is the Greens, and everybody who lives on a continental European nation knows what kind of a disaster the Greens have become over the past 10 years. Here in Germany, the Greens went from being the party which kept us out of the Iraq War to being the full-fledged social justice warrior party that it is now. And this is no joke. The German Greens are the party of the social justice warriors. Admittedly, the Austrian Greens are not as bad as that. They have a different political history, which involves not just university student protest movements, but also more conservative-leaning nature conservationist movements from the countryside. You go through the webpage of the German Greens and you immediately are confronted with feminist bullshit and how Germany must be made more diverse. Whilst when you go through the Austrian Greens page, you will find an emphasis on environmental protection, social programs, human rights, and anti-far right talking points. The German Greens demand the borders to be unconditionally reopened, whilst the Austrian Greens believe that border controls are reasonable in solving the migrant crisis and that there have to be limits in what can be done. So there still is a significant difference in how the Austrian Greens are more centrist and less radical as those you would find in Germany, yet I would argue that they are slowly moving into that direction. There are radicals on the left, especially in the areas of Vienna, who would, if the opportunity is given, gladly take hold of the Austrian Green Party. You will also find the social justice nonsense within the Green Party programs in Austria. The difference to Germany is that it is not a priority and comes in third position after environmental protection and employment and social issues. So the ideological basis for authoritarian social justice nonsense is there, despite how many of my Austrian subscribers may wish to deny it. The Austrian far-right Freedom Party is also significantly different from the German AfD. It has existed longer and has a more controversially ridden history than the young AfD. The Austrian FPÖ was founded by SS veterans after the end of the Second World War, and for most of its history was a collection point for extremist right-wing positions. Its party color, the cornflower blue, is also not a mistake, since in German political history this was the color of greater German nationalists who believed that all German-speaking people should be united under one nation. Having people around who believed in a greater Germany rather than Austrian sovereignty, as well as regular scandals around Holocaust deniers and other weird remarks concerning National Socialism, didn't do the party well for most of its history. So throughout the past 10 years, the Austrian FPÖ has tried to rebrand itself, as well as what it stands for. Islam has become the main threat that it advocates against, whilst it previously used to rant against Polish immigrants and Slavic immigrants. Its leaders went on trips to Israel to make alliances with far-right Israeli politicians. Ties to the American Tea Party movement were also built. Fantasies over nationalist Greater Germany were replaced with an emphasis on Austrian sovereignty. However, those fringes are still there and are not going away, making it hard for someone like me to accept that the FPÖ is sincere about ridding itself from these elements. These elements, for example, show themselves when the party publishes a cartoon depicting the government as the servant of Jewish bankers, depicted in a rather stereotypical way. I remember discussing this with Stardust a few months ago. The European right is desperately trying to change its image to look less insane, whilst the European far left is going increasingly more insane. And it's hard to tell how sincere the far right in Europe is about leaving the vile parts of its movement behind, or if they are even sincere about leaving those behind in the first place and not just trying to cover them up. Bottom line being, whilst the fringe white nationalist movements of the American far right don't play much of an important role in influencing the US right, as can be seen with how David Duke was, for example, completely annihilated in his Senate bid. That very same fringe does, however, have significant influence and a role within the elements of the European far right. This election is a disaster. The choices are between a potential social justice warrior and potentially the exact opposite right-wing extreme. Neither appeal to me. And as some might vote for what they consider to be the lesser evil, I think I wouldn't be able to vote at all, confronted with those two choices. You might disagree with me on that, but fundamentally my main commitment is to democracy and preserving the democratic framework of European societies. Watching the democratic middle collapse throughout Europe makes me fear for the stability and future of this continent. I will take solace in the fact that the presidential office in Austria is mainly a symbolic office and does not come with too much political power. There will be a live stream on this election, and I hope I will see you there. I'm going to leave links to it in the description.